This week we're going to look at chapter 5. And chapter 5 really talks, it's a short time span that we're talking about, only about 20 years, as you can tell from the chapter title. We're only looking at 1910 through 1930. And it's called the New Colonias, and it's basically like the development, dispersal, and diversification that's happening within these new colonies within the borders of the US. And there's a lot in this chapter. A lot of like small sections. So you've got all this that's covered, which it does look like a lot, but remember it's taken in very small chunks in this book. So let's start with the new industries really quickly and look at those. So really what we have is, we're coming out of the Victorian era, we're coming into the 20th century, and modernization really gave way to old ways of labor and work. We have a lot more machinery that's available to us now. So automobiles lead to less reliance of the railroads, and also farming is going to become a very big business. New industries, because of the mechanization, because of the industry that's happening, really opens up more opportunities, and it's a pull factor for Mexican immigrants coming into the United States. There's also, remember, in Mexico at this time, you have a civil war that's going on. And so that's going to be a push factor, pushing those Mexicans out of Mexico and having them cross over the border. And if you want to see the destination of these immigrants, because it does vary a lot, look at table 5.1 in your book, and that will give you an idea of kind of like where everyone is going, because we're really spreading out further. So there is some other things going on. We have trying to retake and reclaim parts of Mexico. And Ricardo Flores Magón, he's going to lead a new political party, the PLM. And what they do is they stage an invasion of Mexico to try to overthrow Diaz. He is imprisoned for espionage, and unfortunately he dies there in 1922. But you're going to notice these like small acts of like rebellion and revolution that are happening throughout this chapter. And majority of immigrants, though, once they move across the border, they're not too concerned with politics, at least not the kind where we're trying to overthrow government. So that's really like, yeah, I want to control like local politics, but I'm not looking at overthrowing US government or even Mexican government. American culture, heavily influential in the Hispanic communities. You guys talked about Mexican identity, and really looked at that in an essay. And so this is also like kind of peeling those layers back. Like, what does it mean to be Mexican? But now I'm a Mexican and now I'm an immigrant. How does that play out? And how does that like look different, and how influential is this American culture in trying to fit in order to make it easier, my transition? World War I, it does help in that the American government was trying to mobilize everyone for the war efforts. And because of that, they do look at minority groups, like how can we get these minority groups and pull them in? If you Google like World War I propaganda, look at propaganda that includes like Hispanic, Mexicans, look at propaganda that includes even African Americans, the Black community. You'll notice there are like posters trying to recruit from those minority groups. So again, it's for the war effort, but we do see that recruitment and that cohesion happening. So Mexican descent population began moving out of the borderlands, so out of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, because of that modernization that's happening. And so manufacturing, meatpacking, railroad construction, farming, those are all areas where we're going to see a lot of minorities, a lot of Mexicans taking jobs in. Mexicans had reached New England. So think about East Coast and like the 13 colonies, those are all on the East Coast. Those are predominantly, we refer to them as white. So by 1930, we have Mexican immigrants that have made their way there, really showing how quickly Mexican culture and influence has spread across the US in such a short amount of time. Think about it before, really located here in the Southwest where we are in Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, a little bit of Utah, Nevada, California. That's really where it was heavily influential. But now we're talking about in a very short amount of time, Mexicans are already like their influence is in New England area. But even though we spread more, there's still a lot of prejudice and discrimination towards Mexicans after World War I. Stereotypes portrayed in films, stereotypes portrayed for Native American, Black American, and now our Mexican American stereotypes. And it's the stereotypes that you've probably grown up with and heard all of your life. They're lazy, they don't like to work, they're dirty, all of those things that Anglos are portraying, right? Jim Crow laws applied to Mexicans too. So you probably heard about Jim Crow affecting African Americans. Those same laws also apply to Mexicans as well. Segregated schools. That's going to be important. There's an important court case that happens in 1947. Nativism, if you're not born here, you don't belong here. Even if you're born here, but you happen to be Mexican descent, you still don't belong here. And then issues raised by those opposed to immigration and, those who favored it. So look for those as you're reading through the chapter. Little Mexicos. So rural means countryside, living in the country. Urban means city. So barrio living conditions were very primitive. Your neighborhood conditions are very primitive, even in the big cities. There's no paved streets. There's no electricity, no running water, no garbage collection. So what that leads to, it's very unsanitary, like it's stinky. It's a bed of disease is able to take over and get people sick. However, a few middle class people are able to succeed because they can blend in and they can pass, right? They speak English well, they came from some money, they're able to move. It's really hard for people who don't have a lot of money to be able to pick up and leave the barrio and move into a nicer neighborhood, but some are able to do that. However, the bulk of Mexicans, more than 90%, were in the lower class, meaning they were poor. We also have these rural estates and political struggles that are happening. Pattern of migrant work evolves. So migrant workers, they move with the crops. Whatever's in season, that's where you move, and that's what you pick as you are, migrating throughout the seasons. What we notice are Mexicans are kept in a very low level, so low pay, low skilled, but very high risk jobs, meaning they could get sick, they could get hurt very easily. So many Hispanics are going to join forces to push representation into government. And you have one who is the governor of New Mexico, supported bilingual education, helping farmers and laborers. But then you also do have some of this backlash to the plan of San Diego. So in this plan, and I put it here for you, go to Wikipedia and look up the plan of San Diego because this happens in Texas. And it's really these 3 different stages. And if you want more depth information, Wikipedia, that article is actually a pretty decent article that talks about it. They're trying to overthrow the U.S. government in the Southwest and establish a new republic. That's what happened in the 1830s and 40s in Texas anyways. So they're just trying to recreate that. However, it does not go as planned. It does not go well. Los Manos Negras, those are the fence cutting. So, we talked about after the war, the Mexican-American War, Anglo settlers came in and took over that Mexican land and just displaced all of those who had been there for centuries. It was ancestral land at that point. And so we have the Whitecaps, or that's another group that's going to be fence cutting, but so are these guys. They're fence cutting and trying to take over the land that was originally theirs. So you can see again these little revolutions and these little things, acts of aggression that are happening throughout history to try to reclaim space. Formal and informal ways to show discontent at work, right? You don't have to throw this big revolution and try to take the southern part of Texas. You can slow down at work, you can slow down production, you can break tools, you can destroy the plants that you're working on. And this does sound a lot like what slaves are doing to rebel during the time of slavery. We also have trying to work and create unions for Mexicans, especially migrant workers. Spoiler alert, this is not something that's going to work well until later on in history. But notice in this chapter the forming of unions and trying to unionize for farming and what benefits the union would bring. Women's roles. So very traditional beliefs, these are very based a lot in Catholicism. And so men work outside of the home, women stay at home and take care of the family. That is a lot of heavy, heavy religious influence that just becomes part of the Mexican culture. But what we're finding is that is not always easy for women to do. A lot of times women in lower and middle class families end up having to work in order to survive, just to put food on the table because the husband isn't making enough. And so trying to also, you have to remember birth control is not something that is readily available, nor is it culturally accepted within Mexican families. So a lot of children being born within the marriage, and then that's also making it hard for being able to afford everyone. Trying to blend the old tradition with modern ways of life. You have the younger generation that it's going to talk about, and then some women are able to make it well into paying jobs. So kind of look at how that happens for women. Also take a look at schooling. Um, it's funny how we are going to whitewash even like Mexican schooling. So very segregated, but also the curriculum being taught, it's more about white culture, not a lot of Hispanic, Mexican, Native American, the blending of, not a lot of that is being taught even in these segregated schools. So parents sent them, and knowing all this and knowing how bad it is throughout the chapter, just in hopes of them being able to attain a better life than what they had. Religion is going to be very important to Mexicans. It always has been, especially the Catholic influence, the Catholic Church. So pay attention to that. And then also the arts, developing the arts more. This is at a time when the Harlem Renaissance is happening. The new Negro movement is happening. There is going to be a movement within the Hispanic community as well, really taking cultural pride, right? That's what the Harlem Renaissance was about Black pride and Black identity. There's going to be a lot of this within the theater and within bilingual literature and then within journalism. So pay attention to that. And it doesn't come out and say like brown pride or like Mexican pride or Mexican movement, but you're going to notice there's more talk about arts and literature and how taking pride in your heritage is starting to really be the forefront of this kind of artistic expression. Journalism, Spanish language journalism, Spanish newspapers, Spanish magazines, calling for unity to end discrimination together. So that's really important because in the 30s, we're going to hit the Great Depression. And we don't seem to really worry about equality and civil rights for the different groups. But we get out of the Depression because of World War II. So in the next following chapters, you're going to notice more and more court cases and groups that are getting together to fight against discrimination and discrimination against Mexicans, Hispanics. So pay attention to like this brown journalism and how that's going to become influential and kind of spreading the word about what's going on within the Spanish speaking communities.